All right, hello everyone. We're going to go over your exam today, or your exam review, and cover all the stuff you'll need to know for the exam. A couple of reminders: the exam is posted now, and it's due May 8th by 11 o'clock at night. Also, I'm teaching a summer class, Geography 104. It's physical geography, and it's a lab class. We're going to work with it online. We're going to do Zoom 2 days a week of the 4, and then open lab, and then just a recorded lecture 1 day a week. So it should be pretty fun. Okay, so I'm looking at your final exam study guide that I posted on Blackboard. Remember, it just comes from so I got a computer over here. Anything after the midterm. It says it's worth 90 points. It's worth 50. So I cut it in half. It's 25 questions, each worth 2 points for 50 points. Globalization, that should come from that definition comes from the very beginning of the book. It also comes from some of our earlier lectures, but the greater interconnectedness between people and places throughout the world. Globalization started in the 1970s as like a capital G globalization. There was always globalization before that, think like Columbus, etc. But this type of globalization was all about trade, cultural exchange, free markets, and then we started to see a lot of critiques coming of that. You know, it's the greatest thing in the world. There is no alternative. Those kind of narratives, we saw those in the 90s and 2016 election. Localization, don't worry about that. Okay, so let's get into our first subject that we covered after the spring break when we went online. So what did political geographers study? So this comes directly from our lecture on political geography that's posted online on Blackboard. And it's pretty early in there. So it's like the third slide. It says the study of the political organization of space, control and influence over spaces and places, distribution of political phenomenon like voting, political parties, etc., and then conflicts over territories and borders. So as extreme as war, or more of like a less warlike conflicts. All right. Next, what do we got next? Go over there. State and example. So this is important. A state is a political unit that has sovereignty. So don't think like Kansas as a state. We don't use this term a lot. It's a political geography or political science term. But we kind of call it United States is from this terminology, kind of. But mainly like we think of as a country or nation. But the term for what the United States or the United Kingdom or France or Germany is a state. So they have sovereignty, which means they can tax their own people, they can start war, they have a permanent population, and they have a permanent population. Oh, and they're legitimate. So they're most other countries see them as a political unit. All right, so it's not an economic unit, like let's say Microsoft is a company, that's not a country. You can't just go to an island and say you own this, because you have to have other countries say, yeah, Uzbekistan actually is a country. But Salistan is not a country unless other people recognize it. It has its own government, its own form of taxation, etc. So examples of a state, any country you can think of. Sovereignty, it's self-rule. All those things I said, you can tax your own people, you can go to war, and it's seen as legitimate, whereas like if a terrorist organization goes to war, it's not seen as legitimate because they're non-state actors. And sovereignty there's a definition in the lecture, and it's straight out of the textbook from that chapter. The United Nations, formed after World War II, it's all the countries in the world, and they come up with goals. They're all about cooperation. So it's not like economic, it's not an economic treaty. It's not a pact for war and alliances. This is just an organization that saw the disaster that was World War I and then World War II, and they decided to get together a global cooperation organization. It's in New York City. Every country is represented, and it was formed after World War II. All right, imperialism and colonialism. These are two very basic definitions. You can look it over. The big difference is colonialism. Sorry, there's a bug. You set up shop. So like the British set up colonies, there were schools there. Imperialism is more like the United States and Latin America 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 30 years ago. Is you have a direct influence, but you don't have like colonies. You don't have people setting up shop there and living there. Evolution of the modern state, what I want you to know is it's new. During the American Revolution, we had like 33 empires, and now the idea of a state where you are loyal to the state itself. In the United States, you may not like Donald Trump, you may love Donald Trump, but we don't overthrow because our country is not ruled by a king or queen. We're not loyal to that figurehead. We're loyal to the idea of the United States. So the idea of a state is that no matter who the political leader is, you are loyal to the country itself, to the land, to the ideals for the United States, like freedom and democracy, etc. The Berlin Conference, this is really important. It's in both the lecture and in the book. And basically, in the late 1800s, 1860, let me bring that exact date up. All the big empires came and they carved up Africa. And even though there was plenty of African empires at that time, they intentionally did not include any of those empires and quelched them. So no African voices were actually heard. And then that's how we get all these crazy borders in Africa. And sorry, hang on, let me get that slide up. It divided many African nations among European empires. No African nations themselves or their empires were represented at the conference, and it had a lasting impact on country boundaries, where they would divide it by empire and not by, let's say, long-standing cultural ties of that tribe or that community. So it really led to a lot of the issues that we see in Africa today. Was kind of the seeds of that were planted when they had no voice and were divvied all up. All right, next. So Berlin Conference is pretty important. Newest countries in the world. This comes directly from a slide. So think about countries like East Timor. South Sudan is an important one. There's a whole list. A lot of them came, they're not young compared to you guys. Like in the early 90s when the USSR collapsed, there was 15 new countries that emerged. Bosnia is a new country. Did I say Bosnia? I meant Kosovo. My bad. Okay. I went way too far. Okay, now we're on to urban geography. 6 features of cities. Don't worry about them. Why people live in cities, you can think of it right now. We would have had a great discussion about it in class. But to be close to entertainment centers, to be close to jobs, because they like the lifestyle, good amenities like free public libraries and museums, things like that. Urbanization, people moving into cities. The rate, so it's your urbanization rate is how many people in a country live in cities. How many country live in cities? Urban geography, don't worry about it too much. Urban geographers study cities. How the Industrial Revolution influenced urbanization. I'm realizing I'm going a little fast. It way upped urbanization. So with the Industrial Revolution, first part of that revolution was that farming communities, so we're thinking it started in England / the United Kingdom in the 1700s, and then it spread to places like the USA, Western Europe, etc. And there was a lot of technological advances. So farming became more mechanized or done by machines. And so people did not have jobs on the farm, and then there's all these jobs in the city. So this, for Western European, North American countries, this was the first big influx of urbanization. Whereas urbanization really grew in places like Japan, South Korea, and the rest of the world later, like post-World War II, and then sometimes even recently. So urbanization was a big part of the Industrial Revolution. All right, I'm thirsty. Historical characteristics of American city. Don't worry about that. I wish we would have Anyway, Central Business District, downtown. CBD, downtown. It's where, like, it's the hub. So Manhattan is a good example. Racial and ethnic restrictions to housing. Right there. Redlining, blockbusting, and white flight. The book goes over these pretty well. White flight, you might not think of it as like a racially restriction to housing, but it was the idea that realtors preyed on the fears of white Americans in the mid 20th century, a little later sometimes, and said, oh, a bunch of African Americans are moving in here. And so they tried to push, or white people were scared and they ran to the suburbs. And that led to the best housing stock being in the suburbs where many African Americans weren't allowed to live because of redlining. And then the bad housing stock was in the cities that were now becoming less invested in. There was less good schools, there was less good businesses, etc. And then blockbusting is similar. Blockbusting is from the realtor's end of white flight. White flight is more from the homebuyer's end. All right, gentrification. So gentrification, you can get the definition straight out of the textbook, but, oh no, working between a lot of things right now. Don't do that. Anyway, gentrification is basically the idea of a neighborhood. It's the process of urban residential change, so housing change in urban areas where more affluent people, so think people with more money, move into lower income neighborhoods. So this leads to renovation, which is the positive end, but also the displacement of the local community, because especially in communities of color, like African American communities or Latino or Asian, they were unable to buy homes because of racially restrictive housing policies. And now that they're becoming, the neighborhoods are becoming the cool places to live, they don't own the places they don't own the places and the businesses. So as the rents go up, as the housing value goes up, they're unable to, in many cases, enjoy that success. They're just kind of pushed out by the rise of rent. All right, that's happening in Kansas City. It's happening in all the cities. Urban redevelopment from the 1990s, late 1990s onward, we see a lot of reinvestment in urban areas. So think Power and Light District was part of urban redevelopment, trying to bring people out from the suburbs and back to downtowns, revitalize our downtowns. Food deserts. Food deserts are important. There's a couple of videos about the food deserts, but basically they are generally, not always, in very rural areas or in inner cities, and it's where you are far away from healthy, affordable food. So there might be food like a convenience store or Casey's general store, but if you want to buy, let's say, a package of strawberries or anything healthy, spinach, what have you, they either don't exist or they're super pricey. And one of the reasons that these have a major impact is because they limit people from accessing healthy food. They can lead to obesity, heart disease, and other health concerns because you have the food you have access to is delicious, but it's things like Cheetos, kind of these highly processed, highly salty foods that aren't necessarily the healthiest for you. And then they really do impact the most vulnerable. So the very poor that can't afford to shop at, say, Whole Foods or a place that's nicer, or the people old that don't really have or possibly have mobility issues, that can't get places. And same thing with rural areas. Like if you have to drive so many miles for a good grocery store and you're busy and you're working 2 jobs, you're not going to go to that grocery store. And then also for people that maybe don't have access to a car. Okay. Why suburbs emerged post-World War II? Secondary jobs are both manufacturing and construction. We think about manufacturing a lot with Fordism, but construction was a huge part of the post-World War II economic boom, and they were good jobs. So we were building houses for all the returning veterans that were getting these white families that were getting these great homes in the suburbs. And then we were also building highways. An extensive highway network was built in the United States in the 1950s. So the suburbs emerged and then car ownership. So people could, just under Fordism, make your workers be your consumers. So people were home, they were happy, they were starting their families with, birthing all the baby boomers. And people wanted to not live in a cramped city. They wanted the suburbs with the front yard and backyard and whatnot. So car ownership was a big part of the rise of the suburbs. So was the building of highways, and good jobs, so people could afford the housing. Some people could. And then urban issues facing the Kansas City area. So these are what you did your project on. And even if you only did one, know the other ones too. So good education for all of us, and accessible and affordable. You're college kids, you understand, college humans, you understand that. Bringing middle-class jobs to the area, fighting crime, and revitalizing the east side of Kansas City. All right, we're going to take a break, and because I want to make sure this works, and then I'll come back with development and the rest.